Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about, leadership in the Idaho Senate. Now, I know a lot of people are kind of looking at the upcoming election and thinking, okay, well, the outcome of a number of different issues is going to depend on whether it's a conservative or a moderate or even a liberal majority in there. But you'd be surprised how much of it depends on the actual leadership positions as to what bills legislators are even allowed to consider in the first place. Well, Jim Guthrie is throwing his name in the hat to be the Senate Majority Leader. We're going to talk a little bit about what that might mean for the Idaho legislature.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and it's my privilege to sit down with you twice a week and go over some of the issues that maybe don't get quite the attention they deserve in our legacy media. So I've talked about Jim Guthrie on this program before, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation, actually, Ron Nate wrote an editorial piece back in, I believe it was March, talking about Jim Guthrie's habit of sitting on pieces of conservative legislation. And, they were defeated not by being vigorously debated and then either passing or falling on their own merits, but rather they were just held captive in Guthrie's drawer, which became kind of a pocket veto, if you will, to keep them from ever seeing the light of day. So when I saw the news story was published in the Idaho Dispatch saying that Jim Guthrie is announcing he's going to run for Senate Majority Leader, that caught my attention because he has a track record that we can look at. And I want to make clear, in examining Jim Guthrie's track record, this is not to out him as a bad person or, as someone who is evil. It's just to look at his record and then, hopefully for, those who are responsible for making those kind of leadership decisions, who are they going to elect as their leader in for instance, the Idaho Senate? They need to think really carefully because there are some troubling things that Guthrie brings to the table. So let's start with, first of all, Brian Almond. First of all, I guess we'll start with Jim's email to his fellow Senate colleagues. And then Brian Almond has a marvelous piece that he wrote earlier this week in the Gem State Substack that really covers this in detail. And I think gives not only a fair shake to Guthrie, but also covers it in enough detail that you could make your own mind up. Guthrie, in his email to his Senate colleague, said, "In this email, I'm reaching out to all current members of the Senate Majority Caucus to express my intention to run for the position of Senate Majority Leader." Now, he says, "I will reach out separately to others likely to join our caucus after the November election." And he says, "This is not a decision reached easily, but I make it with the utmost confidence and work ethic needed to fulfill this important leadership role." Now, as I recall, it was back in the primaries in May that Chuck Winder was basically shown the door. And from my conservative viewpoint, probably for good reason. Chuck was not behaving in a really conservative fashion and was actually stymieing and fighting against other conservative members of the Senate. And so it's probably fitting that voters, at least conservative voters in that primary, showed him the door. Now, let's talk a little bit about Jim Guthrie, though. In going to Brian Almond's Substack, he gives us some background here, and this is pretty basic stuff. This is not, oh boy, it's a hit piece, but he points out that Jim, who comes from the tiny town of McCammon in Bannock County, has been in the Idaho legislature for 12 years. Now, he took over as chair of the Senate State Affairs Committee back in 2023 from retiring Patty Ann Lodge. And it was Patty Lodge who had that habit of holding conservative bills in the drawer rather than bringing them to the committee for a full vote. And Brian Almond points out, if anything, Guthrie doubled down on the practice to the point where Ron Nate, who's president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, listed 16 different bills that Guthrie had unilaterally halted. In other words, these weren't brought up for a vote. They weren't even brought up for consideration. He just decided, well, it's my prerogative not to bring them up. And so they sat in the drawer and there they died. Now, a lot of these bills had already passed the House, but for some reason, and again, this was Guthrie's call, they were not given a chance in the Senate. And I'm just asking, does that seem right to you? Or does that seem like a little bit of one man making a few too many decisions for everybody else? Here's a list of those bills. I mean, everything from gender definitions and rules to prohibitions on government mask mandates, protecting patient rights, protecting the right to conceal carry firearms on college campuses, a month being declared to honor Idaho's traditional families. And look, the point here, and this, I'm going to go to what Ron Nate said, is you don't have to agree with any of these bills. The point is not that everybody should support these and nobody should dissent. Ron says you may agree or disagree with some of the bills listed here, but the problem is one senator has taken it upon himself, to the exclusion of 104 elected legislators and our governor, to decide these important issues once and for all. This is not how representative government is supposed to work. And again, I get it. Some of those were hot button issues. Some of them were things that might have been very hotly contested. It might have caused some arguing. Well, guess what? The legislature is a deliberative body. It's their job to argue things out. They're supposed to hash it out. And sometimes it's going to not be so pretty. So let's stop pretending that we should only suggest bills that everyone will automatically agree on and pat each other on the back when they're done passing them. You know, sometimes they're needed, sometimes they aren't, but they need to be debated. That's where real action takes place. Going back to Brian Almonds' Gem State Substack, he reports that over the course of his 12 years in the legislature, Jim Guthrie has amassed a lifetime Freedom Index rating of 51%. Now, he peaked at 82% back in 2018, but fell to 36.3% in 2024. This puts him at the bottom of Republican senators. In fact, he was only ahead of Senators Chuck Winder, Abby Lee, Jeff Schroeder, and Linda Hartgen, all of whom were shown the door and will no longer be in the Senate next year. But again, this is the guy who wants to be, basically the second most powerful office in there in the Senate. His rating from the Institute for Legislative Analysis was similar, 35.4% for the 2024 session. Now, flip it around, and on the other hand, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, IACI, they gave him a score of 85. Same score as Democrat Senators Rick Just and James Ruchti. So, yeah, if you want someone who is going to lead and vote as a Democrat, it looks like, he might be the guy. Guthrie may be your guy. But if you want someone who's actually representing smaller, more responsive government, more responsible spending, less spending for that matter, it might be wise to look elsewhere. He also sponsored a bill in 2023 to grant driver's licenses to illegal aliens in Idaho. I know this is a hot button issue for a lot of folks. This is the concern that Brian Almond brings up here is Guthrie was supported by Poder of Idaho, which is an organization that supports illegal immigration. But look at the logo of Poder of Idaho. That clenched communist fist. I'm sorry, that is, some people, it's just a sign of solidarity. But you know what? Why is it only the communists believe in that clenched fist solidarity? Not a good sign. Also, Guthrie signed on as a public member of the Main Street Caucus, which is a coalition of the most progressive legislators in the Idaho Republican Party. These are the people who are sometimes referred to as rhinos, and for good reason. According to an analysis by Idaho Freedom Action, Guthrie voted with his Democratic colleagues 81.7% of the time. And again, he was only behind fellow Main Streeters like Jeff Schroeder, Linda Hartgen, and Abby Lee, all of whom lost their primary election earlier this year. So I want to go back to, the idea that Senator Guthrie wants to be the Senate Majority Leader. And Brian Almond writes that that's a position that sets the tone for everything the Senate does during the election. The Majority Leader conducts business on the Senate floor. This is important. The Majority Leader decides which bills are heard at which times, even which bills go to committees. So given Guthrie's record of blocking conservative legislation in Senate state affairs, seems likely he would use his influence to do the same thing for the entire Senate if he was given the opportunity. Now, maybe he's turned over a new leaf. Maybe, he's ready to not be quite so ideological, or at least to try to thwart, a conversation in the name of trying to protect a certain ideological stance. But let's go back to Senator Guthrie's email to his Senate colleagues. He says, "It is not lost on me that we have a caucus with more diversity than in any time since I've been in Boise." And he says, without a doubt, that can come with challenges. I submit to you that we can let those challenges end in stalemate or consider them opportunities for consensus building. I'm sorry, but you know who else engages in consensus building? There's that fist. I'm sorry, but when you talk about crowd manipulation techniques, the facilitator comes in there to build consensus, and this is totally communist crowd manipulation stuff. Now, I'm not saying he's doing commie things. I'm saying he's leaning toward the kind of tactics that are used by literal Marxists. Different perspectives can stimulate a more thoughtful process in finding the best path forward, says Jim Guthrie, as we make important policy decisions. Right, but only if you let those bills actually come out and be debated. If you just deep six them on your own decision, are you really allowing different perspectives to be heard, or are you protecting, the only approved ones that the establishment would want to be forwarded? So he says, my goal will be to respect those differences of opinion and work to make our majority caucus one of mutual respect as we engage in honest, open discussion. Those are lofty words. I hope he means them sincerely. But looking at Jim Guthrie's track record, we have every reason to question and maybe even to doubt that that's what he's going to do. So let's sum it up. Brian Almonds says, look, the scramble for leadership leading into the next session was sparked by the defeat of current Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder. That was in the primary to newcomer Josh Kaiser. Current Majority Leader Kelly Anthon is rumored to be running for Pro Tem along with Senators Doug, I don't know how to say your name, Okoniewicz, and C. Scott Grow, also Senator Lori Dan Hartog, who unsuccessfully challenged Winder for leadership in December of 2022. All of them have declared their intention to run for majority leader as well, setting up a contest for the hearts and minds of Republican legislators leading into the caucus elections this December. So the idea here is Brian Almond isn't telling you this is how you have to vote. I'm not telling you this is how you have to vote, but I am saying that when someone with a track record of not necessarily representing, either the GOP or the conservative values that he ostensibly is running on, wants that position of power, you might want to engage in some healthy skepticism and really question before you give them that kind of power. And if it's possible, there may be someone better suited to this position. So there you have it. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing